Great weekend. I'm Bill Hemmer. Good morning. Welcome here to America's Newsroom. What's happening, Shannon?
Good Monday morning to you, Bill. I'm Shannon Bream. The White House says something needs to be done to counter the Obamacare death spiral. A new report from the Wall Street Journal shows insurers may possibly be ready to drop coverage altogether in parts of Iowa and Tennessee and to spike premiums in Virginia and Maryland. White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus saying Republicans will eventually be rewarded for supporting the new health care bill.
There are some times in life you have to do what's right, not what's politically expedient. We believe this is going to be a better product, and by the time that people see that
and the White House then didn't really do anything about it until Flynn misled the vice president about the nature of his conversations, that would certainly be an embarrassment to the White House. But in the end, you have to be faced with this fact. Flynn is gone, and indeed long gone. So, you know, how much political mileage anybody will be able to get out of what Flynn did or did not do is unclear to me.
Okay, and all of this is, of course, against the backdrop of the investigations into potential Russian interference, potential collusion with the Trump campaign. So far, both sides of the aisle say they have no evidence of that, of collusion between the campaign and about Russia. But it seems all sides agree there was definitely some meddling and interference. But it also leads to this question about unmasking and how that happened in the context of these Russian investigations. But somebody we won't hear from today is Susan Rice. Her attorney basically said, we weren't consulted on the dates. 2 weeks is not enough time to prepare for this kind of hearing. What say you?
Well, I think eventually she will probably testify. If she doesn't want to do it voluntarily, they can always subpoena her to testify. So she'll have to come in and tell her side of the story. And, you know, she clearly asked for the unmasking of at least one official who was caught up in a foreign intercept. So we'll see what comes of that. Whether it turns out it was anything highly improper or not remains to be seen, but she'll have to testify. And I think her position on this was, while it would have looked better for her to come and testify right away, you know, after all, how much preparation do you have to do to simply tell the truth? But they'll get her eventually. We'll see.
Yeah, and so far, Lindsey Graham, who's heading up this subcommittee hearing today, says he's not prepared to testify or to subpoena her, but he says we'll take care of her. I mean, he does sound like he has a plan to get her under oath. And, you know, that could be interesting. Or like you said, sometimes these hearings, the expectation is so built up that you don't get the silver bullet or thing that you're looking for that would wrap everything up in a neat, tidy bow.
That's right. But, Shannon, I will say this. I've done this for a long time in Washington. Every now and then, one of these hearings happens and somebody says something you didn't expect and hadn't heard, and it changes everything. I think famously of Alexander Butterfield testifying before the Senate Watergate Committee that there was a taping system in the Nixon White House that nobody knew about. I remember where I was that day and how I heard it. I was listening to it on the radio on the way to a doctor's appointment, and it's a moment I'll never forget, and of course it changed everything in the Watergate scandal. So everybody always hopes for a moment like that. They don't come along very often, but when they do, wow.
Yes, and that's why I like to watch these hearings, even when no one else wants to watch them with me. Britt, you and I will watch them. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thanks, Shannon.
Thankfully, we got Britt out of Florida, right? Where you been, Kim? I mean, come on.
He's been enjoying the southern hemisphere.
Stop reminding everybody.
Welcome back.
Thanks.
We
Thanks,
missed
Phil.
you.
Yeah. Well,
thanks, Britt.
You too, buddy.
Thanks. 9 past the hour now. Here we go. New details on another American detained in North Korea. That brings the number to 4. We talked to former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice on the biggest foreign policy challenges facing this White House, her advice to the president. All of that coming up. Plus, there is this.
France has elected its next president. Did the wave of nationalism that swept Europe now extend to the French? How does it now affect Americans here at home? We are live with details.
A space telescope can make the search for alien life a lot easier. It offers 25 times the resolution of Hubble, and you can see the difference that you would get screen left and screen right. Mike Massimino is a former NASA astronaut, Columbia School of Engineering professor, and senior advisor for space programs at the Intrepid Museum here in New York City. What's happening?
Lots of stuff, apparently.
Wow.
Lots of stuff going on in
You
space.
went to the Hubble twice?
I did, yes.
And that's been a pretty good tool.
It's been great.
Right?
Yeah, it's
and
fantastic.
you launched,
greatest instrument we've had so far.
You launched Hubble by way of the space program because it could fit inside. It was about the size of a school bus, right?
Correct. So it had to fit inside of the shuttle. It was constrained by that.
It launches, and it's given us amazing images deep in space. What would this do that would be so much better?
Well, this is going to be a lot bigger. This is just a proposal right now. So this is the first thinking about what do we need beyond what we have. We have Hubble. 25 years ago it launched. You can learn about it at the Intrepid Museum, Hubble at 25 exhibit. The James Webb Telescope is planned to be launched. It's being built. It's almost done. It's going to be launched hopefully in 2018. So now the smart astronomer people say, well, what do we need next? Because we don't want to stop there. We want to keep going. So this we're looking at about the 2030s. It's a big mirror. So the Hubble has about 7.5 feet wide because it was constrained, as you said, by the fitness shuttle. This thing's going to be about 30 feet wide. A bigger mirror, a bigger telescope. It's going to be further away from the Earth. So it's going to be able to see a lot more in deeper, more detail.
I said 25 times. You say actually 100 times.
Well, 25 times is it's going to be able to see more accurately. But then what they start doing with these things, but you got to be careful because they talk about it's 10 times more powerful, 100 times more powerful. They talk about a discovery potential, which has a lot of factors. It's not just how accurately it can see, but the discoveries it's going to make. It can see deeper. So by being 25 times more powerful, it can see much more deeper into the universe. So it depends how you want to define those numbers. But it's going to be much more powerful.
At space.com, looking for signs of life.
Yeah.
Is that what this telescope is designed to do?
That's hopefully one of the things it could do. I mean, even Hubble's able to identify planets in other solar systems, and it can identify the atmospheres of those planets. But its resolution is nowhere near as good as this thing would be if we get this new one built. So it can only see the really big planets, the really giant ones, like the size, think of Jupiter, much bigger than Earth.
So you grew up on Long Island.
I did.
And you grew up Catholic.
I did,
and
yes.
you've been to space, places we have never been. And when you think about NASA looking for alien life,
right?
When you as an astronaut are up in space, do you think we are the only ones here?
I do not think we're the only ones here. I don't think we've found anybody yet. I don't think we've been visited. I think that if you look at what Hubble has shown us and the vastness of the universe and all the possibilities that there are countless. That for us to think we're the only ones, I think is almost silly.
You think it's too arrogant?
I don't know if it's arrogant or not. I just think it almost seems like there has to be. There might not be. There might not be. When I looked at the Earth, how beautiful it was, I thought to myself, how could there be another place like this? I don't know if there could be anything as beautiful or as perfect as our planet, but I think that there's got to be something else out there somewhere, I think. But we just haven't found it yet. But maybe we will with this thing.
Yeah. Emmanuel Macron winning the French presidential election in a landslide, defeating his right-wing opponent, Marine Le Pen. That victory raising questions about the populist tide in Europe, and Macron acknowledging Le Pen's supporters in his speech last night when he said the following.
Do not boo them. Today they have expressed anger and disarray, sometimes beliefs. I respect these, but I will do everything in the 5 years to come so there is no more reason to vote for the extremes anymore.
Greg Palcat's watching all that live in Paris now with more on the fallout after the vote. Greg, hello.
Hi, Bill. Yeah, there are a lot of magazines out today. I think this is my favorite cover, Le Kid, marking the 39-year-old Emmanuel Macron as the youngest French president in modern times here. He looked pretty skilled last night at a very well-crafted victory celebration in front of the Louvre Museum. This after a 66-34% win over Marine Le Pen. Now, the independent centrist reformer who's never held elected office has got to put together a government. As for far-right populist Le Pen, well, short of what she hoped for, she did get something like 11 million votes. The nationalist message played in some parts of the country, but the polarizing rhetoric did her in. Also, 1/3 of the electorate didn't vote for either one. With economy and security jitters, many French are not happy with the candidates that were put to them yesterday. Here is what we heard today.
Do you think he'll do a good job?
I hope so. For me, it's hope. Maybe for something new, he needs energy for renovation.
Il est jeune, on va gagner.
He's young, and he will win.
Yes.
Oh, pas bien du tout.
No good. Why?
No good.
Why?
Oh, it's
Pourquoi?
horrible.
Horrible, horrible. Quick learning curve for young Macron. He's got a G7 and a NATO summit coming up where he will meet another outsider turned leader, President Trump.
Well, here we go. Thank you, Greg Palcott at the Eiffel Tower. Thank you, Greg. Shannon.
All right, for more on this, let's bring in Nigel Farage, former leader of the UK Independence Party and a Fox News contributor. All right, let's start off with a question that a lot of folks here have stateside. Does this send a message that the populist wave that brought us President Donald Trump is over in Europe?
No, not at all. I mean, look, in the first round of this election, 46.5% of people voted for parties that were fiercely Eurosceptic. In this round, it was more like 35%. What that says is that Marine Le Pen, with the Front National brand, was not able to bring together people from the left and right of politics under her banner. And I think what will happen here is, and I hope, because I spoke to her campaign team last night, I've been talking to her for the last 5 years, the Front National needs to get rid of the baggage of the past, of the shadow of her father. And when she does that, she'll be in a stronger position. And secondly, fascinatingly, 80% of the over 65s voted for Macron. So generationally, it's the older people that are sticking to the old European model and the younger people that are rejecting it. And I would say this to you, that she got 35% this time. In 2022, I believe she'll win.
That is a bold prediction. We will have you stick around 5 years, come back, we'll revisit it and see what happens, because a lot of people are saying that what happens in France in the next 5 years will continue to break the country apart in ways that are, possibly irreversible, with the economy, with the terror threats. And they say that this endorsement of Macron over Le Pen said that people are thinking beyond those things, that they don't like the divisive rhetoric, that she was cozy with Trump, even though he didn't formally endorse her. And they're, saying stateside that it was a rebuke to him and to the kinds of forces that lifted him into office.
Well, look, I think, as I say, the Front National has been a very divisive force in French politics, and much as she's a more attractive figure than her father, clearly not enough to bring all the Eurosceptics that want change together in that election yesterday. But what Macron represents, I mean, look, he walked up to his victory speech to the anthem of the European Union. Imagine that. You become president of your country and you march up to the theme of a foreign nation, and guess where Macron's going this afternoon? He's catching a plane to meet his new boss in Berlin. And in the end, what the French are going to see is 5 more years of failure, 5 more years of being stuck in the wrong currency, and 5 more years of increasing terrorist attacks. The French may not have gone for Frexit yesterday the way the Brits did last year in our referendum, but I believe genuinely, sincerely, it is only a matter of time.
Well, he acknowledged yesterday that there was a lot of anger behind that vote, and he's going to try to work on it, he says. Nigel Farage, thank you so much. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you.
President Trump about to go overseas, his first trip as commander-in-chief, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North on the biggest foreign policy challenges facing this administration.
Plus, a doctor in the House weighing in on how pre-existing conditions would be covered under the Republican health care plan, at least the one we got from the House. It led to a fiery debate on Fox News Sunday this weekend.
The bottom line is there's a lot of trash being tossed about out there. There's no change in pre-existing conditions for the people who are in the Affordable Care Act and are in states that don't have a waiver.
When news breaks, he has the smart breakdown. First, fair and balanced. Shepard Smith, the accurate story and truthful reporting, only on Fox News Channel.
Things many of us take for granted every day, like playing with a child, eating a meal, or walking alone, weren't possible for 59-year-old Steve McMillan. Steve started losing his eyesight about 10 years ago. Within 4 years, he became completely blind and had to stop working.
I went into a deep, deep depression. Scared the hell out of me. It's like, what do I do now? I can't work. I can't see.
Steve was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa, or RP. The rare inherited disease is progressive and affects the retina.
It was hard to see him go through what he was going through. He was always very strong, nothing ever stopped him. And that that totally stopped him.
Unfortunately, there is no cure for the condition. Night blindness is often one of the first signs.
Patients don't have any functional vision. They can't see any movement. They can't see anybody in front of them. And they use canes and they use Braille.
Steve and his wife shifted their lives to accommodate his condition, but he never gave up hope. Turns out he was the first candidate to get a tiny electronic device implanted in his right eye at the Cleveland Clinic. The device, called Argus 2, is FDA approved and bypasses the part of the retina that is not working. After a 4-hour surgery and weeks of rehab using a special pair of glasses with a camera, the device was finally turned on.
I see a glow. Well, the way I'm looking up is probably got to be the lights, but I don't see the lights, but I do see a glow.
Okay. The camera records images and then sends them to a wearable video processing unit. Then the implant in the eye gets the image, stimulates the retina, and Steve's brain interprets the image.
You're warm and glowy, too.
It will take quite some time to get used to using the Argus 2. Steve's new vision is based on contrast, so he will only see the difference between black and white.
You have to learn to move your head to see as opposed to moving your eyes.
Steve had been in total darkness for 8 years. Now he can see shapes and outlines, making it possible to walk on his own, eat a meal, and play with his grandkids.
It's a game changer. You can see the outline of people. You can see the road somewhat when you're walking down the road. You can walk around the house some with the device on and see corners and, lights you had never seen before.
For more information on the Argus 2, check out clevelandclinic.org. I'm Laura Engel, Fox News.
The Affordable Care Act was ending the ability of insurers to say you can't get insurance or you're charged multiple times because you have bad genes. That's a horrible feature of our system. Americans don't like it. Why would you possibly want to reintroduce this?
It does not change pre-existing conditions for the vast majority of people. But if your state waives out, the only thing that they can do is charge you up to 30% more if you have elected not to have insurance coverage.
This was a heated debate over health insurance for people with pre-existing conditions. My next guest wrote a piece in the New York Times over the weekend describing what the Republican health care plan gets right. Dr. Mark Siegel, professor of medicine, NYU Langone Medical Center, with me in studio. Good morning to you. Then Rove pulled out the whiteboard. It was all over there on Fox News Sunday there. Okay, now, 3 things I need to cover with you, okay? I want to keep it in English here. Under this plan and the way Republicans are reforming or would like to reform Obamacare, what does it do for pre-existing conditions?
Rove is essentially right. You're going to get to keep the insurance you have, as opposed to what was promised 9 years ago. You're going to get to keep it with a pre-existing condition unless you're in a state that asks for a waiver and has something in place like a high-risk pool where they could separate out somebody who's very sick who has a lapse in coverage. In other words, it's not everybody. If you're in a state that asks for a waiver, you still have your pre-existing condition covered under the Obamacare type insurance unless you lapse. And then you go into a high-risk pool where you're still covered. Here's the only problem, and it's going to only affect a small number, Bill. If you're in that high-risk pool, what are you going to pay? And that's where I say the government's got to step in and heavily subsidize those pools, because the Kaiser Family Foundation said high-risk pools can work, but they're traditionally underfunded. Let's not underfund them. $8 billion that's been proposed in the current bill is not enough. So high-risk pools for people who lapse in coverage in states that ask for waivers only. Otherwise, Rove is totally right. Almost everyone is going to get their pre-existing condition covered.
It'd be covered.
Right.
So when someone makes a claim that they won't be covered, they're wrong. Is that what you're saying?
It's just derisive, emotional talk to rile people up. It's not fair, and it's not accurate.
Got it. 2 more issues here. And the piece you wrote over the weekend for the New York Times. You gave 2 great examples. I want to illuminate them, okay? Following is this. A woman age 60 comes to see you every 2 weeks. She thinks she has allergy problems. You conclude she does not, but she still comes back to see you. Why is that bad or wrong, or what would you do about it?
Well, she thinks she's infected, and I can't prove it till I see her. Okay, so when I see her, I can tell she's not infected. And there may be something else going on, but I have to see her to figure it out. But here's the thing. I and many other doctors have to practice defensively these days because we're afraid of missing something or being told we missed something. That's tort reform. The other issue is the insurance system that we have doesn't allow us to charge people more who overuse the system. There's an awful amount of overuse involved, along with a lot of sick people, by the way. I mean, people use insurance a lot in the last 2 years of life. We have a lot of technology. We have an innovation. This is a very expensive healthcare system. On top of that, we're overusing it.
What is your solution to an issue like that if there is overuse in the system?
Frankly, I think doctors should be paid less for seeing people unnecessarily, and patients should pay more for overusing the system.
More burden on the patient.
Absolutely.
Okay. The second
Premiums
example
go up if you overuse your car insurance, don't they?
Yeah, that's true. Second example you give is your 93-year-old father who has a heart condition. He has a piece inserted into his heart, and it cost $50,000. Why do you use that anecdote to make what point?
Well, by the way, thank God my father's alive, and thank God the valve worked. Thank God it worked.
Warrior.
I made the point that in the future, Medicare may not be able to cover all of this innovation, this personalized solutions. A valve like that is only covered probably because some lobby fought for it. Meanwhile, Medicare is not covering enough wheelchairs, Bill. Medicare is going bankrupt, and one of the reasons is a good reason. We have great technology. In the future, that valve may not be covered, so I was making the point that maybe we ought to start saving now with health savings accounts. We have retirement accounts. We have IRAs. Why don't we have a health savings account along with it so that when you get to that age, if God forbid the valve isn't covered? A lot of critics said, wait a minute, you don't want your father to get that valve? Of course I want my father to get that valve. But if Medicare were to turn him down, he'd have another way. And that way would be a more private way, which, by the way, you could take your health savings account and argue, hey, I don't want to pay $50,000. I want to pay $30,000. I want to pay $25,000. And you could negotiate the price.
So all of that goes to costs and what's affordable and what's not. Very
One final point. I want the government to step up also and increase the number of federally funded clinics they have in National Health Service Corps, which currently takes care of 10 million people, and the clinics take care of 22 million people in rural areas. I want to double that so that nobody can criticize our federal government or Donald Trump and say, you don't care about poor people. Let's provide the care directly to people who don't have.
Oh, you know the topic so well. Thank you, Doctor, for making all those points here. Mark Siegel, Medical A-Team, you bet. Shannon, what's next?
Well, we are awaiting a highly anticipated hearing in Washington that could clear up some conflicting information about former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and his contacts with Russian officials. Former Acting Attorney General Sally Yates says to testify before the Senate today. She says she warned the White House. Plus, a sit-down interview with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, her expertise in Russia, what she's got to say now about the state of U.S.-Russia relations, and so much more.
Eventually, the two men will have to go into a room, and President Trump, as presidents before him, will have to say to Vladimir Putin, I understand that Russia doesn't like the way that the Cold War ended, but the Cold War is over.
The Senate's Russia investigation setting the stage for fireworks on Capitol Hill. Former Acting Attorney General Sally Yates set to testify about her role in the resignation of National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. It is the first time Yates will get a chance to speak publicly about the concerns she says she raised with the White House about Flynn and his contacts with Russia. She's set to appear before a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee investigating Russian interference in the presidential election. We will have her testimony live as soon as it gets underway later today.
Amid rising tensions between the U.S. and North Korea, that rogue regime says they've now detained another American held for, quote, acts of hostility aimed at overthrowing that country. That brings the number of Americans now being held that we know of to 4. Now, I spoke with the former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who already believes that tensions in North Korea developed into a very dangerous matter. Her latest book is called Democracy, Stories from the Long Road to Freedom. In fact, it's out this week. In a wide-ranging interview, we talk about this and more, starting with the emerging threat from Pyongyang.
It's a very dangerous situation because over the recent years, they've gotten more capable with their nuclear program, apparently more capable also with their long-range missile program. So it starts to put the United States at risk, and that's what's worrying the president at this point. No American president can allow a reckless, perhaps a little unhinged leader of North Korea to be able to terrorize the United States. So they are trying, I think, a combination of pressure, which is to convince the world that the United States will not stand idly by and let this happen. That pressure is mostly aimed at the Chinese, who have some influence, not absolute influence, but some influence with the North Korean regime, because the Chinese are going to have to do some very tough things in order to change the course of this.
Yeah, do you think Beijing is willing to do that?
Well, Beijing has got to understand that the choice is no longer do we just sort of let the North Koreans go along and we worry more about what if the North Korean regime collapses. Beijing worries about long border, refugee flows. But now they need to understand that the time is really up. As Secretary Tillerson said, the time for strategic patience has really passed.
We heard that from him. President Trump said under the right circumstances, to paraphrase, he would meet one-on-one with Kim Jong-un.
Well,
I don't know how you define the right circumstances.
Yeah, and that's really the key. The key is you never use the President of the United States until the circumstances are absolutely right. And the circumstances right now have to get the international community to really be serious about this, China to be serious about it, to let people know that the United States will put all options on the table, even though, frankly, the options aren't that good.
You talk about Russia. You're an expert on studying that country and the former Soviet Union and Vladimir Putin as well. It appears the one thing that President Trump and Vladimir Putin have in common is that they want to fight Islamic terrorists. They want to defeat ISIS. And the Russians have been a victim of terrorism in their own country. Is that how President Trump best manages this relationship?
Again, context matters here, Bill. And I'm all for the Russians fighting Islamic terrorism because they certainly face it, particularly in their south. But recently in some of their cities, they've had these attacks. Yet you have to say to Putin, but do understand that we take very seriously our Article 5, an attack upon one is an attack upon all NATO obligations to our allies in Eastern Europe, whether they're in the Baltic states or Poland. So don't be confused about that, even if we're going to fight Islamic terrorism together. Ukraine. You have to understand that we're not going to recognize the forcible incorporation of Crimea. And so if the context is right, I think there's a lot that we can agree with and cooperate with the Russians, including, by the way, North Korea, where if Kim Jong-un can eventually reach the western part of the United States, he can certainly reach Russia.
What do you think this president's strongest hand is with Vladimir Putin? They may meet in a matter of weeks, perhaps, maybe this summer.
I think the strongest hand is the reestablishment of American military power as a deterrent. The sense that
sounds like Reagan,
right? This is a president who is not afraid to say that will not stand. So I thought that the strike in Syria was well timed from a number of perspectives. I think rebuilding the American military budget is important as a signal that the United States just will not let certain things stand. But when it comes down to it, eventually the two men will have to go into a room, and President Trump, as presidents before him, will have to say to Vladimir Putin, I understand that Russia doesn't like the way that the Cold War ended, but the Cold War is over. Our allies in Eastern Europe have to trust us, and you have to understand that I will defend them if necessary.
You met with the president of the White House last month.
That's right, yes.
How do you think he's doing?
I think that the president, first of all, he's a completely new circumstance in the United States, somebody who's never been in government at all. That's the first time in our history. But he came to office because there were people in our country who felt that our institutions didn't fully represent them. And I respect that. I respect that they went through the democratic process to elect someone who they feel can better their circumstances and deal both with their aspirations and their fears. And so I will always respect the presidency of the United States.
You're okay with them?
So far, I'm okay.
So more from Dr. Rice later tonight on Hannity. 10 o'clock Eastern Time with Sean later this evening to talk about her book and so many other topics out there. She does no plans to join the Trump administration.
Mm-mm.
She has no plan to run for president, which was the most asked question from all of our viewers out there.
Yeah.
And you could probably think that the reason Rex Tillerson has his job might be in large part to what her contribution was.
What about NFL commissioner? Is that still on the wish list?
I think it could be.
Possibly.
Right. Well, there's only one problem there. You know, Goodell's got the job.
Yeah.
And he makes a lot of money.
Well, when he's
and he
ready,
likes his job.
When he's ready to do something new, she'll be waiting in the wings, maybe. Yeah. All right, great interview.
Thanks.
All right, America's top general visiting a key ally ahead of President Trump's visit to the Middle East. What it means for the fight against ISIS. Plus this.
The atrocities of Nazi brutality were reflected in the delirious joy of the liberated.
VE Day 1945, celebrating the end of the Second War in Europe, an event that changed the world. It's remembered today.
I'm Dr. Manny, and I'm here to answer your questions. Each year, back pain affects half of all working Americans. But could this common ailment be mistaken for something different? We got this email from a viewer.
Dear Dr. Manny, my husband has been complaining of low back pain for years and just recently went to physical therapy where they told him it could be sciatica. What is sciatica exactly, and how is it treated? Thanks, Betsy.
Well, Betsy, sciatica refers to pain that runs along the course of the sciatic nerve. Your sciatic nerve begins at your spinal cord and branches down through your hips, buttocks, and each leg. The pain often occurs when a herniated disc or bone spur in the spine presses on the nerve. But for more on how it's treated, we checked in with an expert.
Typically, we treat this with activity modification and rest, along with nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory medications and muscle-relaxing medications. If this does not give adequate relief, we can often prescribe physical therapy, and some practitioners advocate chiropractics or acupuncture. If those modalities don't give the patient adequate relief, we can recommend epidural steroid injections, which can often be effective. Finally, if nothing resolves the pain, we consider surgical intervention to decompress the nerves.
Thanks, Doc. Do you have a health question? Tweet me at Dr. Manny on Fox. Until next time, I'm Dr. Manny. Hello, I'm Dr. Manny, and I'm here to answer your questions. Osteoarthritis affects millions of people and is the most common form of arthritis. It is caused by overuse when the cartilage between your bones wears away. Here's a question from a viewer.
Dr. Manny, I suffer from osteoarthritis. I take glucosamine, which seems to help tremendously. I would like to know if you recommend eating any specific foods that might ease some of my discomfort.
Thanks for your question. Osteoarthritis can cause pain, stiffness, loss of flexibility, and even a grating sensation. There are some treatments that can help in addition to the supplement glucosamine that you're taking. Those include pain-relieving medications, physical therapy exercises, cortisone shots, and even joint replacement surgery. But you can also eat some anti-inflammatory foods that might help. So add these to your shopping list. Anything high in omega-3s, like salmon, flaxseed, and walnuts. Also add ginger and turmeric to your meals. Olive oil has been shown to help relieve pain, and so have cherries. Be sure to limit any food that causes inflammation like vegetable oil, margarine, and shortening. Do you have a health question? Email them at drmanny@foxnews.com. Until next time, I'm Dr. Manny.
The victory in Europe and rejoicing all over the world is the greater because of the recollection of the triumph of Nazi barbarism and its final overthrow.
In Europe today, they are commemorating the end of World War II, known as VE Day, Victory in Europe, marking the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany in 1945. Japan surrendered later that year in August. And the incoming French President Emmanuel Macron attending a VE Day ceremony today at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, standing alongside the current president, Francois Hollande. It was Macron's first public event since yesterday's landslide election victory. So he got to work quickly, didn't he?
Not wasting any time, hitting
Sure
ground
did,
running.
man.
Lot to be done.
You like it when I speak of the French, don't you, kid?
I do. I mean, it just rolls off the tongue. You are multi-talented. There are so many languages he speaks.
Not much.
I've got Pig Latin. President Trump preparing for his first overseas trip since taking office. During the 9-day tour later this month, he will visit Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Vatican. Today, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joe Dunford, is in Israel to meet with top leaders and discuss cooperation between our key allies. Joining us now, retired Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a Fox News military analyst and author of Counterfeit Lies. Colonel, good to see you this morning.
Good to be with you, Shannon. Thank you.
Okay, so already Secretary Mattis has visited. We now have General Dunford there. What does this telegraph to you, with the president's trip upcoming as well, about our relationship with Israel under this administration?
Well, it makes good sense, because in the aftermath of the meeting last week with the president and Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, there are several new issues of concern in Israel. This is, as you pointed out, General Dunford's third trip to Israel. He's going to meet on this trip with the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, Defense Minister Lieberman, and the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Eisenkot. And as you pointed out, General Mattis has already made a trip out there. All this is very appropriate, Shannon, because Israel is, after all, the only democracy in the Middle East, a strategic ally, and they have a very busy agenda. They've got joint projects with Israel in air defense and ballistic missile defense, concerns about the Syrian civil war and the chemical weapons that they've got, Russian interference with the Israeli Air Force's self-defense strikes against Hezbollah in Syria, and, of course, the ISIS threat in the Sinai to Israel and UN peacekeepers, Iranian support to Hezbollah and Hamas, and the Iran-North Korean cooperation with nukes and ICBMs. A lot on the table.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I got to think that top of mind for Israel as well is Iran's deal, the nuclear deal with the U.S., which our president was very critical of during the campaign. There are a lot of questions and tough talk coming from the State Department and other portions of the administration to Iran with regard to that deal. It seems like for now they acknowledge that Iran's in compliance, but maybe it's not the best deal if compliance is so easily
Well, yeah,
met.
Exactly. Well, there's no doubt that's the number one concern to Israel, and it ought to be for us. Look, it's an existential threat to both of us, and it's likely that the Prime Minister is going to raise that again. He's probably also going to give an earful to General Dunford about reasons why the Palestinian demand for giving up Judea and Samaria, the West Bank enclaves for the Palestinians, would be a disaster for national security in Israel. The president's comment last week that he wants to broker or facilitate a peace deal is potentially a problem, because Abbas does not speak for Hamas. Hamas is armed and funded by Iran. The Hamas General Principles and Policies document that they released last week make it very clear that Hamas is still committed to the destruction of the Jewish state. So as long as Hamas exists, the so-called two-state solution is still a pipe dream.
You mentioned earlier several issues complicating all of this relationship. But with regard to Russia and what's going on in Syria right now, what can the U.S. and Israel as allies do to better that situation?
Well, look, the Israelis are not in direct contact with the Russians in Syria. We are. We have a joint planning session with the Russians every week. We have a communications set up from essentially Iraq to make sure that Russian airstrikes aren't hitting our people. The Russians are very concerned, obviously, about the Israeli strike last week in the outskirts of Baghdad against a Hezbollah weapons column that was getting ready to move from Syria into Lebanon. And so there ought to be some degree of coordination that can be worked out so that the Russians don't start firing their surface-to-air missiles at Israeli aircraft attacking Hezbollah targets.
Colonel Oliver North, always good to see you, sir. Thank you.
Great to be with you, Shannon.
A top-secret mission is over. Well, so what was this craft doing in space for 700 days? We'll ask a former NASA astronaut about that in a moment. It landed successfully after orbiting the Earth for 2 years. It's a U.S. Air Force Boeing X-37B landing at the Kennedy Space Center after 718 days in space. Earth's orbit, we should say. Specifics of the mission, the role of the spacecraft remain classified, so what was it doing? Mike Massimino, former NASA astronaut and senior advisor for space programs, the Intrepid. He's also author of Spaceman, and he is here to reveal the big secrets from space. How are you, buddy?
Doing great.
Nice to see you. X-37B, what does all that stand for?
Well, it's X means experimental aircraft, which in this case a spacecraft. 37B, it started, X-37 was a project that NASA actually had. We were looking for have like a lifeboat spacecraft that could stay on the space station for a long time and then land on a runway. And then that got canceled and turned over to the Air Force pretty much. And so what it's doing, I think what the Air Force is saying it's doing is, I would assume, is what it's doing, which is looking at technologies for future spacecraft and also doing experiments. It's a classified mission, but I think it's
unmanned, right?
It's unmanned.
It takes off like the space shuttle. It lands like a space shuttle,
it takes
correct?
Off like a rocket, yeah. Different rockets,
on a rocket,
different configuration, but yeah, it takes off like a rocket from the Kennedy Space Center, and it lands on a runway. It landed on the Kennedy Space Center runway. It's the first time we landed anything there, spaceship there, since the last space shuttle landing. So it's reusable, but it lands on a runway, which is key. It doesn't splash down
significant,
somewhere.
not as big as a shuttle, but similar in size and versatility.
In the way it looks, it is much smaller. You can fit 2 of these things in the payload bay of the shuttle. The shuttle is much bigger than this, but you're not putting any people on there and not carrying a big payload up and down.
I think the distinction is you can launch a satellite, and the satellite stays up there for years, right? It stays in orbit and until it burns out, or
things go wrong with it.
Things go wrong, or is no longer usable. Yeah. But this was a craft that orbited the Earth for 700 days and then
came back. Right, those satellites don't land on runways after being up there for 7. This thing is landed on a runway after 718 days. So this is presumably something you can keep on orbit for a long time and still bring crew back with. No one was inside of this one.
Give me a sense of the possibilities for what you could do with the technology of orbiting for 700 days and then landing.
I think there's for the 700-day orbit, what you can do, that means you can leave a spacecraft on orbit for a long time and still come down in it. The space shuttle can only stay up there for about 2 weeks. So you had to come back in about 2 weeks, you're going to run out of consumables. Even the Russian Soyuz that we use now to go to the space station has a limited life. It can't stay up there forever. So you have to frequently bring these things up and down. Something like this you could leave up there, give you a second option, and be able to come home in a hurry, but be able to leave it up there for a very long time. The other thing I think is more exciting about this, Bill, is that this sort of thing could lead to a commercial application in the future. You know, the space shuttle program. Well, if you just imagine if this could lead to, just like other military aircraft, going back to we're celebrating VE Day, right? But going back to World War II is the beginning of the jet age. It was the beginning of using airplanes more in the military, as we used them in World War II to win World War II, and it led to an explosion of using the airplane for commercial reasons. Now we have a thriving commercial business. Something like this could lead to technology, I think, that could be this orbital space plane that was talked about for many decades, and we just couldn't do it. It's too expensive.
So it's like New York to Europe in a few hours.
New York to Europe really quick, going across the country in minutes.
Some people think this could disable satellites in space.
You can sort of hypothesize or guess what the military application is, and I think that's the ultimate challenge. If you can control satellites, you run the world. That's a pretty bold statement. I think you're probably right. I'm not sure if that's the major objective of this. I think that that might be it, but I think there's a lot of exciting things that could be spilled over into lots of applications.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Always great to have you. Shannon, what's next?
Well, check this out, Bill. Speaking of the final frontier, if paying taxes on Earth wasn't enough of a pain, think about paying taxes in space. California's Franchise Tax Board wants the public to weigh in on this idea. The proposal would put taxes on commercial space transportation companies. So basically, if a company's rocket launches from California, it'll pay less tax the farther away from Earth that thing travels. We'll see how that does.
Stay out of California, Mike. A Pearl Harbor survivor, a veteran skydiver, celebrating 96 years this way. Well, he says he's now ready to put away his parachute and what he plans to focus on instead. Next.
Well, every time you do something like this, it makes you feel pretty good, Nobody else does it.
A World War II veteran ringing in his 96th birthday by jumping out of a plane. Check him out. Delton Walling is a Pearl Harbor survivor and an experienced skydiver. He says, though, he's putting away the parachute after his latest birthday jump. He's now 96. He says you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. He is sticking to a busy schedule with big plans for traveling and giving motivational speeches. I'm already motivated watching that. Are you kidding me?
Love it.
Thank you for your service, sir.
Feel old already.
It's a beautiful thing. You got several birthdays till 96. Let's go skydiving.
Have a great Monday, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow, right?
We shall.